Assalamualaikum and greetings to all. Before I start, allow me to bid thank you to Ikmal and Lit for this amazing opportunity. My name is Nur Marlisa Shafira binti Muzaffar Farid Adil Fitri and I go by the name Marlisa. I am from the University Technology Mara, currently pursuing my Masters in Applied Language Studies. So today, the topic of my presentation is matters of identity, analyzing gendered language styles among Pahang Proto-Malays in formal and informal context. So without further ado, let us begin. As for the background of study, I believe that we must first understand the overall nature of human languages. Human languages are diverse and complex by nature, made up of different groups, communities, and individuals with various traditions, values, norms, and beliefs that fosters the diversity of languages, thus making languages complex as they are. Therefore, the complexity of human languages is attributable to a combination of factors, including the development of the cultural and social context which varies across communities. Languages are characterized by different cultural and social contexts, reflecting the affiliations of the communities that coexist within a state. Although standard language may be the main medium of interactions in a state, but communities within that state use language in ways that reflect their culture and social norms. Hence, these subtle nuances contribute to the distinctiveness between communities in terms of language used. This echoes from Linehan's 1973 documentations on Pahang Proto-Malays, where he believed that the development of languages among Pahang Proto-Malays came from a plethora of traditions, cultural norms, and speech patterns which are distinct only to that community. Thus, this goes to show that language and identity are inextricably tied to each other, and Pahang Proto-Malays use language as a reflection of their identity. So, as documented by Linehan in 1973, the Pahang Proto-Malays language and culture brings traditional values, cultures unique only to their community, as I stated earlier, and beliefs valuable for humanity's collective heritage. So, the differences in language use between the culturally rich Proto-Malays promote a symbolic identity. The dynamics of language are due to the development of social identities that have emerged through the interplay of language and culture, which shape the community's identity. So, with each community within a state adopting its own way of using language in different contexts, languages are therefore used to draw boundaries and reinforce one's social identity, as distinct language features are associated with a particular community. So, social identities evolve through the dynamic interplay of gender and language used. Overall, since men and women are intuitively different, they are not only biologically different, but the way they use language are also different, especially in various contexts where the language are used differently among genders. Between men and women, they use language differently. So, men and women adapt to changes within their communities by employing distinct language styles in various contexts. So, Tannen in 1986, she suggested that social identity and gender highlights the generic perspective of social identity, where gender plays a pivotal role that affects everyday language used. She concluded that men typically use language that maintains their social identity as powerful, competitive, and stoic. On the contrary, women use language that reinforces their social identity as empathetic and cooperative. So this goes to show that language, culture, gender, and identity are inextricably tied to one another, where overall language is used to reflect one's identity within a community. And with regards to the various cultural and social contexts among men and women use language as a means of communications, and we must understand how languages highlights the differences in terms of language used. So, the significance of studying the intersections of language styles, gender, and identities among the Proto-Malays helps to document the distinct cultural heritage, focusing on their different speech patterns. So, researchers who study the language and culture of culturally rich groups can get significant info into their cultural practices, beliefs, and values, which can assist to influence conservation efforts and foster cultural sustainability. So, yes, this is why language, culture, identity, and gender are tied to one another. Alright, now let us look at the research problem. The main concern that arises whenever we questioned about what does language has got to do with shaping one's identity, shaping one's cultural identity. What is the interplay of language and identity, especially when we look at it in a broader spectrum, when we include gender and identity, especially among Pahang Proto-Malays, where the communities are culturally rich. Therefore, the language reflects their culture. So now the differences are much more concerning with regards to the different language styles used by both men and women. There are different, biologically different, and also the use of language by both men and women are likewise different. So the main question here is, the language spoken among Pahang Proto-Malays is influenced by their distinctive cultures, where the interplay between language and culture shape the overall identity. Alright, so however, the distinct language styles, which according to Juice in 1998 are classified into frozen style, formal, consultative, casual, and intimate. These are the common language styles that we have known. So across genders has yet to be discovered, and additionally the linguistic patterns which highlights their cultural identity, which therefore highlights what type of language styles preference chosen by both men and women among Pahang Proto-Malays. So, to what extent do the linguistic patterns of Pahang Proto-Malays exhibit gendered language styles in formal and informal contexts? That is the question that we must answer. Alright, now let us move over to the review of literature. Due to the differences in gendered language use, scholars propose and propounded theories, opinions, and views with regards to the distinction between men and women's language behaviors. So, Coates in 1993 proposes the cooperative principle, which asserts that women's language is characterized by a cooperative approach, where they tend to use language to build relationship and facilitate communication. Coates further emphasized that women tend to use more empathetic markers such as I understand, or I believe, or I appreciate. On the contrary, men use language that are more assertive and assert their superiority and showcase their masculinity. So, this distinction, however, contradicts Baxter 2003 views on how men and women can actually use language without having to conform to traditional norms and values. However, Baxter's study is rather impressionistic, because he does not focus on the culturally rich communities that still use language which reflects their culture. As we all know, the world that we are living in today is culturally rich. There are communities within communities that are rich culturally, and they still use language as a way to reflect their cultural identity. So their culture reflects their language, hence why Baxter's study in 2003 is rather impressionistic in my opinion. And this can be supported by Rudwick and Change 2011, where they believe that men and women's language, although they are assimilations of modern beliefs where men and women can use language as an individual preferences. They can have their own preferences without having to conform to traditional norms and values. Although they believe that matter, but they actually emphasize more on the fact that human languages and culture are intertwined, and it cannot be understated. So they believe that women's language is more indirect, inclusive, and polite, to show subservience, which highlights their feminine identity, compared to men's direct, exclusive, and straightforward language to assert dominance. Therefore, Rodwick and Change 2011 views on men and women's language use is similar to Coates' 1993 views on how men and women use language which reflects their culture. Therefore, this goes to show that the importance of culture and language cannot be understated. Let's move on to the framework. Allow me to give a brief overview with regards to the framework used to realize this study. So, this study aims to identify the language style choices of proto-Malay men and women in formal contexts, such as ceremonial events or even hierarchical social status, and informal contexts, such as building relationships. So, to achieve this aim, Tennant's 1986 conversational style framework is used to analyze their speech patterns and identify their language style choices, their preferences in this context. So, to analyze the language style choices of proto-Malay men and women, we will first dissect their speech patterns using Tennant's framework. This examination will encompass various contexts, including household interactions, traditional ceremonies, and social gatherings. So, for instance, a study might find that women tend to use more collaborative language, more collaborative speech patterns, for example, asking feedback and even using inclusive language such as we and us. These are the speech patterns that are mostly used by women, while men tend to be more assertive to assert dominance, and they tend to use more competitive language patterns such as making assertive comments or statements and using confrontational language to assert their masculinity. As for the methodology, I would first like to highlight that Tennant 1986 conversational style framework. Under this framework, she designed linguistic devices by which she uses these linguistic devices to construct questions that she asked men and women, because she believed that men and women use language differently, therefore the responses are different. So she used this linguistic device to construct the questions, and then she drew the distinctions with regards to the speech patterns between men and women. She differentiated them both based on language use. So what are the types of linguistic devices that Tennant introduced under the conversational style framework? Okay, so the first one would be the personal and interpersonal topic questions. The questions will be asked consist of personal topics such as their purpose of existing within a community and their contributions to the community. The second linguistic device is known as the enthusiasm constraint, which involves questions regarding personal opinions and criticism on things. Third would be machine gun questions. Machine gun questions is a rather simple question that she will ask regarding their childhood recollections concerning their upbringing in a culture, in a unique culture, will be asked. So these are the questions that are classified under machine gun questions. Moving on, we have the the mutual revelation overlap in speech and pace. So these linguistic devices involve questions concerning their individuality and belonging in that community. And the final linguistic devices is somewhat similar to the previous device, which is bonding device. So bonding device in which the main dynamic is among certain people in a conversation, which is highly expected when participants live in the same community or are brought up by a family who preserves traditions. How do men and women in Pahang Proto-Malay view their traditions and their community? What are their opinions basically? Alright, so for the overall research design, I will employ a mixed method design which uses both quantitative and qualitative method to produce a more objective and thorough examination. So basically, as for the quantitative survey questions are designed using Tennant's conversational style framework, in which several linguistic devices, as I have stated earlier, are used to design the questions to obtain objective responses from respondents on a survey study issue. So the questions are inclined towards language styles in formal and informal context. Okay, formal and informal context is the main issue that I would like to study. So the respondents, a total of 20 respondents, all of whom are descended from the Proto-Malayic tribes of Pahang, specifically Proto-Malay men and women who reside in Pekan Pahang, because according to Linehan in 1973, the most Proto-Malay inhabitants are located in Pekan Pahang, which are classified into Semelai and Jakun. These are the tribes that coexist in the Proto-Malay community in Pekan Pahang. Alright, moving on to the qualitative method. So this study employs a comparative linguistic approach to search for similarities and differences in Proto-Malay men's and women's speech patterns in formal and informal context. So this method is used to comprehend their history, evolution, cultures, and the development of language, as well as to find patterns and trends that affect their overall speech. So this study will use an in-depth interviews to analyze the conversational style of men and women in formal contexts such as ceremonial events and hierarchical status. The reason why is because men and women participations in these two types of matter is different, so therefore I would like to analyze the speech in such context. As for the informal context, such as building relationships, so these are the contexts that I will analyze. Moving on, the data for this study are gathered using live online interviews. So a total of 10 respondents, specifically 5 males and 5 females respectively, they are randomly chosen. However, they must be from the Proto-Malay tribes in Pekan Pahang. So the question asked will be based on, again, Tennant's conversational style framework, and these are the methods that I will employ in order to realize this research. Overall, Proto-Malay men and women grow up in an inclusive, culturally rich community. So the use of language reflects their nature. Informal contexts such as ceremonial events or hierarchical status, men are often expected to be forceful, stoic, and assertive. To embody masculine traits such as independence, competitiveness, and dominance. Even though modern beliefs might say that it is not necessary to perform gender roles based on traditions. However, culturally rich communities such as the Proto-Malayic tribes of Pahang have preserved their cultural heritage. Therefore, their language reflects their culture. So this can be proven by Linehan in 1973, who states that they were adamant in preserving their culture despite the assimilations of modern beliefs. So, as for the Proto-Malay women in formal settings, women tend to avoid direct and confrontational language. On the contrary, as I mentioned earlier, as a reminder, men are more direct. Okay, so on the contrary, in formal settings, women are more indirect. So this was viewed as a means of promoting societal harmony. Women use such language to promote societal harmony even in formal contexts. They tend to use language that are more inclined towards preserving good relationship. So, although ceremonial events among the Proto-Malays are limited for women since they are expected to nurture the home instead of engaging in events where masculinity is inevitable, hence why Proto-Malay women use formal contacts in settings which are only limited to nurturing their family. They do not have access to participating in such ceremonial events because such events are displaying masculinity, which they are not. So, however, Proto-Malay women do speak in formal contexts when engaging in conversation with their superior, for example, their husbands or the chiefs of the community. Alright, so by utilizing a comparative linguistic approach between genders, it is expected that men tend to be more direct in asserting dominance and superiority over others. On the contrary, due to women's limited participations in events or their status in the hierarchy, which are often led by men, as suggested by Lenihan. So women are more inclined towards speaking in formal contexts only when engaging in conversation with their superior, as I mentioned earlier. Alright, so how does Proto-Malay men and women speak in informal context? Last time, earlier, I explained regarding the formal context. Now let's move on to the informal context. So basically, Proto-Malay men's speech in informal context adopt informal language to maintain social relationship, share experience, and build camaraderie. However, their dominance suggests that directness in their speech is applied, though it lacks politeness. They still use direct language to assert their dominance. However, it lacks politeness. It was a way for the Proto-Malay men and women, Proto-Malay men to communicate and express themselves in a relaxed and casual settings without regards to without regards to building a good relationship. They are still assertive, although in informal settings, because that is how they are brought up culturally. Proto-Malay men are more assertive and dominant because that's how they are brought up by the culture. So, on the contrary, Proto-Malay women value their femininity. Therefore, the use of indirect and polite language is essential due to the social norms that these women grew up in. So overall, utilizing a comparative linguistic analysis on Proto-Malay men and women in formal and informal contexts shall shed light on the dynamic interplay of language, culture, and gender, especially in informal contexts. It should prove that men's role as the dominant one affects their language use even when engaging in informal conversations. Directness is expected to be applied among Pahang Proto-Malay men more than women. So their social expectations and norms affect their language use. On the contrary, Proto-Malay women are less direct as they acknowledge their role as makers of harmonious relationships. Thus, this approach helps to discover how cultures within the communities affect language use across genders. Alright, so to sum it all up, in Proto-Malay communities, language plays a pivotal role in shaping the community and maintaining uniqueness and individuality. So, language is significant in Proto-Malay societies because it helps to shape social relationships, convey emotions, and express thoughts and opinions. So, a closer look at the language reveals significant differences in how men and women used it, reflecting their respective social roles and expectations. One of the most noticeable distinctions is the degree of formality used by men and women. So, overall, men's language tends to be more formal, emphasizing directness, superiority, and dominance. As for women, they tend to use honorifics language such as Tuan, which stands for Mr., or Puan, which stands for Mrs. These are the speech patterns that draw the distinction between men and women. So they use such speech patterns to show, to exert their role as a member of that community. Their language reflects their culture. So As a summary, I would like to address that women's language is focused on developing relationships and maintaining social harmony, whereas men's language is more focused on achieving goals and emphasizing opinions, because on the hierarchical status in Proto-Malay communities, men are always engaged in big events, ceremonial events, and their status in the hierarchy is higher than women. So that's why their language tends to be formal and more assertive compared to women. So as women are expected to maintain social harmony and use language in that sense, so that the harmony of their community is maintained, and that is somehow the role of a woman that the community expect them to be. Alright, I think we have reached the end of the presentation. Thank you so much for Iqmal and Lid for this amazing opportunity, and thank you all for listening.